presentation with what I prepared for today. But because yesterday and today, all these presentations have had these beautiful, beautiful PowerPoints, and as a psychologist, I recognize that I now have this acute case, Freudian case of PowerPoint envy that I put, that was a pun for anyone who knows Freudian psychology. So I'm adding a postscript after my prepared talk to talk about the implications of our study of consciousness in a global world today, because I think we have to consider what are the consequences and what are the effects of our definitions and our models and our metaphors for consciousness. A good segue into my talk is that yesterday a lot of our questioning was spent on, or invested in, rather than spent, invested in understanding what is consciousness, that we need to define the undefinable to be able to approach it. Well, I found out in preparing for this talk that if you Google the words consciousness and cognition, you enter this internet loop that spins you around and around in rapid circles as dizzying as the churning of that primordial sea, that entries for cognition lead you back to consciousness, and entries for consciousness often lead to the same research that you had just read under cognition. So at most, cognition is distinguished as a unit of consciousness that consciousness is the entirety of those multiple units. In contrast to that, if we examine consciousness from a non-Western, an Asian or Eastern perspective, we find terms, the drops of knowledge in that. It leads us to this sense of an oceanic consciousness, and words like God realization, illumination, enlightenment, being, pure consciousness, cosmic awareness, and so many others that we risk not being able to see that cosmic ocean for all these waves. So in the contemporary perspective of Western science, psychology regards cognition and consciousness as really undifferentiated categories. They're basically the same thing. If you get a textbook that says consciousness on its cover, you look at the contents and it will be all aspects of cognition. Now, without a clear delineation and definition of these two very different states, misunderstandings arise concerning both the diagnosis and the treatment of certain mental states that have been labeled as abnormal. Okay? By understanding the existence and complexity of cognition and consciousness as distinct psychological states, we gain access to knowledge, to insight, and to experience that is otherwise unavailable by collapsing those two into a single definition. Now, with our goal toward a more differentiated understanding of psychology, we have to question if we have the vocabulary to adequately understand the variety, the totality, and the significance of mental experience. We have to wonder, do the available analytical frameworks necessarily cast into the shadows qualities of experience that do not fit its particular shape and size? What knowledge lies outside this defined and defended space? Could we be missing a vast and complex domain that is the source of consciousness, but beyond cognition? So that's why it's important that we distinguish between them. If there truly is a significant difference between cognition and consciousness that is manifest in experience, that can be studied by science, then we have many questions to ask. How does consciousness differ from cognition? What is its evidence? If it is so readily available, how is it that distinction has not become a major inquiry in Western psychology and object of study? What implications does this have for understanding today? And I think that's a very important question. How does it affect our world? How does it contribute to our world? I, of course, must examine this issue from a Western psychological perspective. But I also will encourage us to be attuned to other ways of understanding this very important issue as we are in this audience. With this question, I make an initial working distinction. That is to define consciousness as the domain beyond what we have traditionally defined as cognition. That's very different from a Western perspective that collapses the two. This is a domain, then, that I will use to consider cases of psychological experience that manifest themselves outside that conflated framework of cognition and consciousness. If a consciousness exists that is different from our understanding of cognition, it will leave its traces in the arena of everyday awareness. Okay? It is those traces of consciousness, like fragments of an ancient manuscript, that I hope to locate in various accounts that I will share with you today. I will approach this in the following ways. First, I'd like to examine certain current impediments to our access to understanding of the domain of consciousness within Western psychology. To use testimonies of people whose experiences speak to different domains of knowing. Then to examine the scientific means that we have available to understand their accounts. And finally, to propose that the basis for the claim of a separate consciousness. So let's go back to 1960 to look at a time when our presumptions of understanding were deemed authoritative, but now we see as terribly misguided. Let's keep that in mind, because in 20 years they're going to look back to 2008 and say how terribly misguided we are today. If you gave birth to a child then that seemed to be in its own world and inattentive to the feelings and interactions of others, yes, you can recognize that what I'm talking about is autism. We call it by the name of autism today. Then you were called a cold and bad mother that produced this behavior in her child. We were called the refrigerator mothers then, right? It was all our coldness that produced what we call autism today. Now, don't protest. The women here that are mothers that might recognize this situation, you can't protest because, of course, with a Freudian model that we're operating on with this kind of outcome, that just proves how cold, uncaring, and oblivious to the needs of your child that you are. So you have to accept this. Autistic children weren't diagnosed, of course, then as autistic. They were labeled as childhood schizophrenics or mentally retarded and treated, meaning institutionalized, accordingly. Then the world changed. An epidemic of German measles resulted in significant numbers of autistic children born to mothers who had German measles during their pregnancies that led scientists to suspect that there might be a correlation here. Okay. Overnight awareness changed. Today, autism is seemingly everywhere. We have been able to study the autistic brain to the extent that scientists either separate autistic children into camps of high and low functioning autism, or suggest even that we are looking at very different illnesses. But researchers still have no precise measures to identify and sort individuals with autism disorders. You see the dilemma? We call it all autism. We have one label for a variety of experiences, and yet we don't have the means to put them into this category. In fact, precise and stable diagnostic criteria are lacking in psychiatry, which identifies itself as an evidence-based field of medicine. Sorry. What if what we currently call high-functioning autism, the savant that Diane spoke about yesterday, is something as radically different as calling an autistic child schizophrenic or mentally retarded today? What if we are in that same situation that the mothers were in before 1960? What if we are looking at a radically different consciousness that out of our ignorance we cannot recognize? What if we admitted that the high-functioning autistic child displays a different type of cognition that leads to intense focus, complex experience, and exceptional insight? What might we call the child then? How might that change our presumptions about consciousness? We might question our assumption about consciousness and cognition to expand our understanding of the complexity and diversity of human thought and human experience. Sometimes knowledge is simply a matter of science catching up with experience, but at other times it is a matter of science misguiding us. In a different case, doctors have bypassed, and this is a quote, standard validated methods in diagnosing bipolar disorder, things you know as manic depression, due to the increased availability of medications. In other words, it is easier to medicate than to diagnose properly. Dr. Gamey and his co-authors of the summaries of the findings of the 4-year study of the International Society for Bipolar Task Force states that diagnostic guidelines are almost an afterthought to treatment guidelines. And then he describes this as the predicament. He describes this predicament as creating treatment guidelines without diagnostic guidelines is like trying to wash your hair with shampoo, but not water. The two things go together, right? In other words, we're all in big trouble here. We medicate without knowing why we medicate. A recent study by the Brown University Medical School revealed that fewer than half of the patients received a proper diagnosis of bipolar disorder. But, and you can guess this outcome, all were medicated for bipolar disorder, right? So we have multiple levels of problems in that because they're medicated for something that is not what they're suffering from, right? Okay, what about the recent recognition, or I should say the recent labeling of BIID, which is Body Integrity Identity Disorder? The court now is considering legal authority for surgeons to remove a patient's healthy limb or other body part because people suffering from this psychological disorder cannot recognize their body appendage as part of their own bodies, right? In other words, this is someone else's hand. That's pretty creepy, right? If you're walking around with someone else's hands attached to your body and you believe that. And what happens in these cases is people go to dire methods to get rid of that hand, you know, self-mutilation and the like, because it's not part of them. It's a foreign appendage. How then can we approach an understanding of a greater consciousness when we have difficulties understanding the varieties of cognition of which we claim authority? Okay, let's start this inquiry by examining the analytical frameworks that we have taken for granted in our current understanding of cognition and consciousness. And again, it is from a Western point of view. And I won't add the things because I think this is very Western, and I'll show you some maps later backing this up. Not that this isn't now being promoted across the world, and we'll talk about the pharmaceutical industry's involvement in our definitions of mental health in the West. Okay, so let's start by examining the analytical frameworks that we are taking for granted in our current understandings of cognition and consciousness. I'd like to start with a consideration of cognitive processes with 2 examples that I'll ask you to diagnose. Okay? Just listen to the following vignettes and then we'll talk about what you think is the most likely diagnosis available in our current state of knowledge, okay? Ready? The first account is a true verbatim transcript of one man's experience of altered consciousness. All I will tell you about him is that he is educated, middle-aged, married with children, and has worked in the past as a lawyer. Here's his statement, okay? These are his words. What I did hear was like a voice from afar, and yet quite near. It was as unmistakable as some human voice, definitely speaking to me, and irresistible. I was not dreaming at the time. I heard the voice. The hearing of the voice was preceded by a terrible struggle within me. Suddenly the voice came upon me. I listened, made certain it was the voice, and the struggle ceased. I was calm. Joy came over me. Not the unanimous verdict of the whole world against me could shake me from the belief that what I heard was the true voice of God. For me, the voice was more real than my existence. So what do you make of this account? Are you able to make sense of it? You have here perhaps evidence of schizophrenia, maybe bipolar, a little extremes there. Or maybe it's just stress. I mean, the guy's a lawyer after all, has kids, you know, difficult life at home.
Or maybe a swami.
Or maybe a swami. Yeah. This is the wrong audience, obviously, to see this as a problem. Okay, so I'm not going to answer yet. I'm going to give you the next scenario. Now, my next statement comes from an elderly man, okay? Now, he does have a difficult marriage. He has 4 sons and worked as a stone mason. Here's his account, okay? When people talk about me, they make me forget who I am. They make riddles to confuse me and make me see if I can identify their tricks. They make fun of me and my communication with the spirit world, yet they say they believe in God. It's just that sometimes I'm overcome with a sense of suspicion, and I know that this is a sign from beyond not to do something that I had intended to do. It's not often, just sometimes. And I turn away from what I then know is wrong to do. I can see that I have said enough, too much. There are many who hate me, but it isn't their hate that'll destroy me, it's their envy, jealousy, and spite that'll kill me. Just like it's killed saints, sages, and all the good people of the world, they've destroyed many of us, and after me, they'll murder many more. Okay. What do you make of this? What diagnosis? A little paranoia there, right? A little schizophrenia, a little disruption of thought. Narcissism, right? The world is, you know, it's all the world's fault, right? So where is the hope for such a person to live a fulfilled life? Right? Then we have to look at our models of consciousness now. Now, I suspect that many of us, maybe all of us, labeled these experiences of dissociated thought as evidence of schizophrenia, perhaps DID, dissociative identity disorder, or maybe bipolar. What drugs, because that's the next step, right, in Western medicine, what drugs would you suggest that these men take to ease their symptoms? What courses of treatment? Okay? So we have a therapist here, but not in the way, I won't put you on the spot, don't worry. We have a psychiatrist here. I won't put you on the spot either, but anyone at this conference, you know, is not going to answer that, which makes my point anyway. Even if they do agree to take these medications, I suspect that the drugs will have little effect on their symptoms. Yes, the drugs to treat any of these mental states are powerful medicines whose purpose is to modulate the chemical environment of the brain. So why might these pharmaceuticals not work with these men? We know that a patient's resistance to medication is a powerful inhibitor to the drug's chemical action, just as a patient's compliance takes advantage of the placebo effect to assist its efficacy. Why might these drugs be ineffective on these two very different men with similar disorders? I propose that the reason would be that their hearing of otherworldly voices did not arise from the depths of delusion, but on the contrary, from enlightened minds, as you guessed. In other words, through an experience of consciousness with a capital C. Our first patient was Mahatma Gandhi, talking about the divine voice that guided him. And our second patient was Socrates, his words excerpted from Plato's account of his trial for treason in Athens. Well, if they lived today, well, they were both killed, so, but we would have medicated them for sure. Well, you may say that it takes a certain level of madness to achieve the extraordinary accomplishments of these two men of history. But isn't that missing the opportunity to bring their testimony into our study of consciousness? First, we know that there is a psychological type that claims communication with a personal God, right, on the DSM list. And though that type is this, the psychological diagnosticians recognize that such people, now think of Gandhi, think of Socrates when you hear these words, that such people that have communication with a personal God tend to be egocentric, chronically anxious, and suggestible. Right? Now we have a mismatch there. I mean, I don't think anyone sees Gandhi or Socrates as chronically anxious, egocentric, and suggestible, right? Okay. There is enough historical evidence available on each of these men so that we may claim confidently that neither of these men fit into this psychological type. Gandhi first talks of a voice, only voice with a capital V, 7 times, and then qualifies it as the voice of God once. Socrates, likewise, defended himself in front of the Athenian jury by arguing that his daemon, the voice that told him what not to do, was similar in substance to the gods, but not an Olympian deity. In the limitations of our capacity to distinguish finer mental states, we dismiss both men's testimony to altered cognition as interesting, but basically irrelevant to their contributions to knowledge and humanity. If we do not examine their claims to a superior voice that offers guidance, are we not then usurping an expertise that has no validity? Just as the scientists and psychiatrists of the 60s rejected what they didn't know was possible, we say there is no evidence of a consciousness, no difference between cognition and consciousness, simply because our current frameworks for understanding do not admit to one. What presumption! We claim this intelligence to prove the absence of an intelligence of which we have no knowledge, yet we have before us testimonies to this intelligence. Can we justifiably dismiss Socrates, Gandhi, and other less notable witnesses simply because we do not admit such a framework for knowing in cognitive science today? Socrates was a decorated war hero, yet on his way to join the city's enlistment for the recent war effort, his spiritual voice told him to turn around and go home, not to go. Like Gandhi, he heard a voice of instruction directing his action. Socrates returned home despite the significant consequences with the state that were sure to ensue. Gandhi's voice advised him on the problem of untouchability in India. When his supporters learned of Gandhi's decision to admit untouchables into the ashram, they withdrew their financial and political support of the ashram and Gandhi's effort toward liberation and independence. Both men testified to an altered state of consciousness which would be considered disturbed or hallucinatory or schizophrenic if we simply put it under the category of cognition. Two features emerge clearly from these examples. First, the men believed that the voice they heard was not a feature of disturbance, but connected them with a higher truth, gave them insight, and motivated them to action. Secondly, the voices connected them with a humanity through a transcendent morality. Socrates refused to participate in an immoral war. Gandhi refused to participate in an immoral law. Thus, we have two features of consciousness. It is manifest as an experience beyond the individual, and it facilitates a humanistic morality that may challenge the social context in which it is experienced. Certainly, both elements have brain evidence that could explain their manifestation. Through the use of fMRIs, moral cognition has become a burgeoning new field of research, locating brain regions for empathy, gratitude, compassion, and other native virtues that tap into deeply ingrained instinctual functions. This consciousness develops through the aging process and through long-term, and even the researchers today are specific about this, long-term regular meditation. And with a quote here from one of the investigators, this process is a progressively more harmonious mode of development, not self-centered, selfish behavior. That process of development which unifies both the person's conscious and unconscious modes of cognition and behavior. Perhaps this seems reminiscent of both Jung's goal of individuation and Freud's outcome of a strong ego that, for Freud would say, leads to a life of common human unhappiness. For these frameworks, we don't necessarily need to distinguish between cognition and consciousness. But when we consider what long-term training in meditation offers to this inquiry, however, we are compelled to focus on the difference between simple cognition and consciousness as a larger state of awareness. Dr. James Austin, who investigates the neurobiology of cognition as it is manifest in the practices of Zen Buddhism, explains that, and these are his words, long-range meditative training can nurture our development toward this kind of maturity. Austin looks to the brain's actualization of these virtues in sites that provide reorganization of networks whose deep roots extends within more midline regions, including the thalamus, basal ganglia, hypothalamus, and brainstem. This is very interesting that they locate it in that part of the brain. That would go along with Jung's, the instincts, the archetypes being symbolic expressions of the instincts being fundamentally positioned in the brain. This state of being could be expressing the deep central core of networks underlying consciousness. Austin describes this state as feeling selflessly in the world and of it. It is a paradoxical awareness that characterizes consciousness. We have already seen how easy it is to put this testimony into familiar categories of mental illness. Our guides testify to certain qualities of experience that characterize this sort of consciousness. Voices that arise from a state of silence, selflessness in the world. Neither man suggested that these extraordinary experiences were irrational, spontaneous, or serendipitous. Instead, this state of consciousness came about through intense commitment to what each of them identified as truth, and sustained practice toward the manifestation of truth in the world. They are adamant that this quality of consciousness is achieved through a practiced mind. Gandhi tells us, and this is a quote from Gandhi, before one is able to listen to that voice, one has to go through a long and severe course of training. And when it is the inner voice that speaks, it is unmistakable. This quality of consciousness that we may identify as superhuman is ultimately and paradoxically humanistic. Thus, Gandhi described the goal. This is what he says. I'm endeavoring to see God through the service of humanity, for I know that God is neither in heaven or down below, but in everyone. One of the other speakers gave that quote similarly. Empirical studies of positive practices of selfless service has demonstrated this sort of paradox. Students often describe the feeling of having found themselves by losing themselves in such service. In this way, the smallest action has significance toward the well-being of the whole. I'm sure we could find associations there with quantum theory. Consider, for example, the testimony of one of my students who was moved by her experience of working with newly arrived refugees. She relates, "My refugee families from Somalia and Burundi gave me the opportunity to break bread with them at their family's dining table, which was indeed a rewarding and most humbling experience." Now, what she describes goes beyond meaningful into transformative. This is what she says. "I know now that there is a bonding of the human mind and spirit. Language and race are of no significance. I realize that every action we undertake and every word that we speak has the power to change a life for the better." What better testimony to the manifestation of consciousness with a capital C than the words of this young university student? Like Socrates and Gandhi, she has discovered the voice from silence and selflessness that transformed the world. That is the consciousness that is within us all and between us all. Finally, let's grasp this power to bring peace and prosperity to the world through our recognition of extraordinary consciousness. So that was the talk I prepared for today. But I think what I thought, as I said, I had my acute PowerPoint envy moment, and so I thought I have to have a power. I have to have some visual for these people, and I guess it went black through the whole talk after all that. What I'd like to show you is what the implications of this model has for the global world. The model that says we will treat varieties of consciousness as mental illness and medicate, right, them. Now, I just, as a story, I'll just tell you, I went to my doctor the other day and she was frazzled, and she, and when they're frazzled, they tell you all the good stuff because their defenses aren't up, right? And she says she feels like she is a stewardess on the pharmaceutical airline, that she brings the tray to her patients and says, well, would you like whatever? I don't know, would you like some Paxil? Would you like some, whatever, take whatever you want, right? That's what she feels is her role. And in fact, and this is how the insurance industry colludes with this, is we all get a receipt after our visit, and it's checked off, low involvement, medium involvement, high involvement, right? And they get paid accordingly, according to how much involvement. That's not the word involvement, but you know what I mean, how much work they did with us. You cannot, as a doctor, check high involvement, even if you spent 3 weeks trying to figure out what was wrong with your patient, unless you gave that patient a prescription. Then you get the highest reimbursement possible. Okay, we're in deep trouble here, right? Forget Ayurveda, whoa, that takes time. No prescription there, right? So we have to, and this is what is making our understanding of consciousness really that's not going to happen in the Western world, and that's why these type of conferences are so valuable, is pushing this issue, pushing this this reality, this actuality, out of the potentiality, into our worlds, because it's so important. Why are we so sick in the West? We have one of the highest, and that's what I want to show you these maps about. Okay, this is the world as we know it, supposedly, right? Now, what's wonderful about this website, and certainly, it's available to everybody, is that the people who did this website, it's really great. They did the size of the nations in proportion to certain issues in proportion to how much they had of those issues. Okay? So let's go to the next map. Okay, so according to population, our world looks very, very different, right? The United States has shrunk considerably, and we see India and China growing. That's the number of people in the world. That's how the map should look according to population. Okay, let's go to the next one. Whoa, huh? Look at that. And look at poor Africa. Poor Africa, one of the richest lands on our globe. And look at the US, right? We also have the money to pay for these drugs. That's really crucial, right? And the pharmaceutical industry is designing drugs, then turning around to the advertising industry to invent diseases, right? So, for example, one is, not that incontinence isn't an issue for a number of diseases or age, but now, you know, that will be promoted to women, right? And you almost want to bring in the diet industry with that, with all the water they make us drink. But now the pharmaceutical industry can offer us a drug. What is this all about? We're being used to make profit for a system that is not invested in our mental health or our physical health. Now, the next one, let's see. Is that sad? Because, what's that? Issues of certainly AIDS, of not being able to have clean water, and not having food, right? Notice how we don't suffer with a recent food shortage around the world, but that's a significant issue for most of the world. Okay, let's see what else they have. Yeah. And I don't want to, you know, it wasn't a talk on the drug industry, but there has to be a way that we address that issue, because pharmaceutical companies, you know, get tax write-offs for dumping drugs on the third world that have gone beyond their expiration date, and by using third world populations as their samples as well. Now this, I think, is directly relevant to the talk. Look at our spending on healthcare. Look how Africa disappeared after just seeing the level of concern about health they had. All of this, that how we just got inflated, was because of the pharmaceutical industries. We now have mental illnesses that can be treated with drugs, or else they don't exist. That's basically the standard now of mental illness. So, okay. Energy consumption, again. Although now with those $2,000 cars, right, India is going to inflate a little bit. Yeah, we have so much in the West to be ashamed of, honestly. And I think, I'm not sure, I think that's the last one. Why I pursued these was we got a new textbook, a new intro psychology textbook in our department, and they made the mistake of, in their introduction, putting a map like this for how much psychological theory, where it's produced in the world. Well, 96% of psychological theory is produced in Western Europe and America. Now, that's wonderful that a lot of the people here who spoke today are going to have their books published, so at least, you know, I don't feel as bad about that 96%. But what that means is the rest of the world isn't represented. When I teach psychology, and when psychology is taught, it's taught as the human mind and the human experience. It's not taught as Western Europe and America psychology, okay? But there's a big concern there that what we're promoting is a model that can't even articulate the difference between cognition and consciousness. Okay. So I will, I don't know what, I have no idea about time, so.
Questions for Dorothy?
That was a very nice lecture. One broad question, which is, isn't it inevitable that as technology advances, we are all going to be bound together through different systems and rules and regulations, and in a general sense enslaved, metaphorically if not physically? And even from an education point, something that Ivan Illich, for example, talked about 38 years ago, that schools themselves are a means of that enslavement. And therefore, in this situation, which is inevitable, it's not appropriate perhaps to critique the West, because West has been dominant for some time, because if it was some other system, there would have been enslavement of some other type. Any ideology enslaves us, right? No matter what it is, no matter how liberating it might have appeared at the time that it was proposed. So the point then is that, first of all, I agree with you that if the academy and the classroom imprisons and makes us less conscious in some sense, it's seminars of this kind which provide the counterpoint, which make it possible for us to break out and then perhaps see things the way they ought to be. But perhaps what it really means is that whatever we do closes doors. Whatever education we receive in many ways is foreclosing possibilities. And therefore, the moments that we are truly conscious, the moment when we are brave enough to break away and jump up and soar in the sky, are first of all going to be very few because of the conditioning that we have, not only through the academy, also the media, the books, the TV shows. In fact, my sister, who's a professor at University of Hawaii and who teaches topics such as this, she says that she can't even take it. I want to go to some other place where I would be away from this enslavement through the media, through the drug companies, through the whole variety of structures that we have.
I think, can I just address, I think she's mistaken about thinking there is another place.
Right.
I mean, I'm not saying that the East, I just didn't address that, but I am locating this in Western Europe and America because we control the knowledge, you know. So anyway, I just wanted to...
I agree entirely with you, and I tell her exactly the same thing. So, but in any event, wouldn't it be therefore a part of this system that we are within, that the normative thing would be to put somebody down who's trying to stand up and say that, well, the emperor has no clothes. If Professor Schaefer says that maybe we can look at this particular problem in this particular way, then perhaps the National Science Foundation is going to cut off its funds because they would say this guy's a heretic. So in some sense, we have not really moved beyond how the church treated its dissenters 500 years ago.
Right, and I think we have to be very much have that in our mind as we proceed. Because yes, the institutions are very powerful. I still don't know how people voted for Bush, right? You know, and I still don't know how he's in power and why we're satisfied with just doing our time till he leaves, that we have a problem there. So yeah, and it's not easy because you do risk. You risk your livelihood, you risk your safety and many things. But I think that we have to maintain a critical perspective, and we cannot look to systems for those answers. The systems do respond. These systems respond to money. Like, you know, now we can get reimbursement for acupuncture, for example. That's because the market shifted, not because the institutions, the AMA, decided that acupuncture was an effective source of healing. So what we do in our everyday life does make a difference. You know, and I think that we cannot look to systems, and I don't think there is any place else in the world that, oh, I'm going to leave here, but that place has the answer. I think we have to look at what we are doing in our community and make that difference. And there is a ripple effect. There's a huge ripple effect. We oftentimes don't see that. You know, I have to have that faith with my students that some seeds will grow someday somewhere.